I killed man in front of his family. I was in college at the time, living the life I thought I wanted. Part-time classes, fraternity events on the weekends, a circle of friends who meant everything to me. But I was restless, juggling papers and parties and just barely scraping by in my classes. I didn't realize how deeply that restlessness would change my life until one night. One single, ordinary night. That ended with a tragedy I'll never escape. We were hosting a party the next night. It was supposed to be a big deal. A blowout for the fraternity. A celebration of the end of midterms. My job was to grab the liquor and some extra snacks. So, as evening fell, I hopped into my car, feeling that slight exhilaration that comes with being young and unmoored. I'd taken the same route 100 times. A straight shot from the house I shared with a few brothers over to the liquor store and back. A simple errand. In a neighborhood I knew inside and out. It was dark, but the streetlights glowed their standard yellow against the asphalt. I remember thinking about a new song on the radio. Something that had been stuck in my head all day. I glanced down for just a second. Maybe to switch stations, maybe to check the volume. I'm not even sure. It was just a moment, a flicker of time so brief that if I tried to measure it, I couldn't. When I looked back up, a man appeared in front of me, crossing the street. I can still see the way his figure filled the glare of my headlights. The shock was instant. I don't recall slamming on the brakes as much as I recall screaming, some raw, terrified sound that burst out of me, half disbelief, half horror. Then came the impact. My car struck him before I could process what was happening. He hit my hood. Everything in my vision turned into a blur of motion and noise. Then the squeal of brakes and the heavy thud of him hitting the pavement. Time stretched. I remember shaking so violently I could hardly breathe. The seatbelt cut into my collarbone as my car lurched to a stop. My first thought, awful as it was to press the gas, to speed away. Panic telling me to flee, but something else overrode that cowardly impulse. I jerked the car to the side of the road, flung the door open, and stumbled out. I saw a group of people standing outside a restaurant, well lit behind Themon. Some neon sign glowed in the background. I can't even recall the name, but I remember seeing colors, bright red or orange, against the night. They were screaming. They were terrified, huddled in a small cluster along the sidewalk, and in the middle of the chaos lay the man I'd just hit. He wasn't moving much. Blood stained his face, his nose, his mouth. Two men crouched beside him, frantically calling 911. Every now and then, his body seemed to tremble. I felt my knees go weak, and I managed to take a few steps closer. All I could say was, "I didn't see him. I didn't see him." As if repeating it would change what had happened. My entire body shook so hard I worried I might collapse right there. Someone must have called an ambulance, because soon sirens cut through the night. But for a while it was just me standing under a street lamp, staring at this scene I'd created. I still see it if I close my eyes. The man lying there, people crying out around him, and me standing just a few feet away, unable to do anything but mutter apologies, tears streaking down my face. His family, because that's who they were, his family, had been at the restaurant with him. This was supposed to be a normal evening for them, stepping out for a nice dinner. Instead, they were on the sidewalk, eyes wide with fear, voices choked with sobs, watching paramedics load him onto a gurney. A woman stood there, her face so stricken it barely seemed real. She looked older, her posture stooped, clinging to another relative. It didn't register that she was his wife until she let go and came toward me. I'd sunk down on the curb by then. My hands were over my eyes, tears streaming, breath coming in gasps. My brain was stuck on a loop. You killed him. You killed him. Even though I wasn't certain of his condition, that dark possibility overwhelmed me. Fear and shock poured out of me in frantic sobs, and I vaguely recall being aware of people's eyes flicking toward me. I was the driver. I was the one who had done this. Then she, his wife, sat next to me. Her movements were slow, almost gentle. She placed a trembling hand on my shoulder. That single touch felt like a jolt to my system, and I froze, so certain she was about to scream at me, or strike me, or unleash a torrent of fury I deserved. But instead she told me quietly that she'd been married to him for almost 50 years, that they'd shared a good life. Those were her words. We had a good life. A hush seemed to fall on the chaos around us. She leaned forward and hugged me. I felt the warmth of her arms, the weight of her sorrow, and she whispered that she forgave me. I'll never forget that moment for as long as I live. Her voice cracked on the words, and mine did too as I wept into her shoulder. It was the single most profound act of compassion I've ever encountered. The paramedics shouted for people to give them space. Lights flashed blue and red in the dark, and I barely registered any of it. I could only think about how this woman, who had lost so much, was now comforting me. It didn't feel right or fair. It just felt surreal. He was taken away in the ambulance, siren wailing as it sped off. I don't know how much time passed. It might have been minutes or hours, but eventually the police arrived. They took statements, measured skid marks. I stood off to the side, every part of me numb. I vaguely recall someone guiding me to the squad car, letting me sit in the back seat. I was in shock, just shaking and sobbing. Maybe I answered questions about my name or my license, I'm not sure. I only know I ended up at the police station, giving my statement again. They tested me for alcohol or drugs. Everything came back negative. I had nothing but a soda that night. My blood alcohol level was 0. I told them repeatedly that I looked down at the radio just for a second and didn't see him crossing. They asked if I was speeding. I didn't think I was. If I was, it wasn't by much. The road was lit well enough, but it was dark, and I took my eyes off it at exactly the wrong moment. It turned out the man had died from his injuries. I don't recall how or when I found out the official news. It might have been that same evening, or maybe I heard it from a friend the next day. I just remember feeling like the world was tilting beneath me. 1 second of inattention. 1 second, enough to end a life. My immediate reaction was guilt, so enormous and punishing that it crushed me. I withdrew, couldn't speak, couldn't function. Even though it was eventually ruled an accident, and there were no legal charges, that offered me no comfort. I felt like a murderer in every sense except the technical criminal one. They released me that same night. A friend from the fraternity picked me up. He tried to hug me in the station parking lot, but I couldn't handle the touch. My mind was stuck in that moment. The man's body on the street, his wife's shattered expression. I could still feel her hugging me, whispering that somehow, against all logic, she forgave me. What good was her forgiveness if I couldn't forgive myself? I spent the next few days locked in my room. The party I was supposed to help organize fell apart, obviously overshadowed by what I'd done. My fraternity brothers tried to support me, but I shut them out. I wept and replayed the accident 1,000 times in my head, wishing I could have a do-over. If only I hadn't messed with the radio. If only I'd decided to get the liquor earlier or later. If only I'd taken another street. The guilt strangled me from the inside, and the nightmares came relentlessly. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw him lying there, heard his family's wails. Even though I tried to go to classes the following week, my mind wasn't there. I stared blankly at lectures, left assignments undone. My grades plummeted almost overnight. Everything felt hollow and pointless. How could I move forward as if nothing had happened? A man died because of me. The weight of that simple fact made me feel undeserving of normalcy or success. Eventually, I dropped out. Senior year was so close to being done, but I couldn't stay. The campus was a reminder of who I'd been before the accident, and I wasn't that person anymore. Instead, I moved back in with my parents, carrying with me a shame that wouldn't let up. I spent days lying in bed, blinds drawn, barely eating. Sleep brought only nightmares, and being awake meant confronting the memory, so I drifted in a fog that offered no peace. My parents tried to help. They suggested therapy. Sometimes I tried a session, but I couldn't open up. How do you talk about killing someone by accident? How do you put that into words that don't sound hollow or contrived? Guilt is a single syllable, but it weighs more than entire sentences. Then came the drinking. It started as a way to sleep without dreaming. I'd down enough alcohol to pass out. That worked for a while, until I woke up with a pounding headache, and the cycle repeated. I lost job after job. I'd missed shifts because I'd overslept or was too hungover to function. My managers tried to be understanding, but how could I explain why I was always miserable? Why I felt so disconnected? Eventually, they fired me, or I quit. Either way, I kept ending up back in my old bedroom, in the house I grew up in, with my mom and dad watching me in helpless worry. The lowest point came on a random afternoon when I grabbed a bottle of pills and swallowed enough that I hoped I wouldn't wake up. I had reached a conclusion. My life was forfeit. I had no right to keep going when someone else had lost his. It was selfish. But that's where my mind was. If my father hadn't found me in time to rush me to the hospital, I wouldn't be telling this story. I remember the clinical lights, the smell of antiseptic, the sting of an IV in my arm. I remember my mother, tearful and begging me to stay alive, that this was not what the man or his wife would have wanted. But in my fog, I just felt relief that I'd almost escaped. I wish I could say that moment was the big turning point, that I magically recovered and found purpose. The truth is, it was just one more step in a long, painful journey. I tried some more therapy, and over months, years real, I began to accept that I might never rid myself of the guilt, but I could learn to live with it. I worked on controlling my anxiety and self-loathing, and I had to face the fact that I hadn't just harmed the man and his family. I was also harming myself and the people who cared about me. Somewhere along that line, I made a decision. If I was going to keep living, I needed a radical change. That's how I found myself joining the Navy. I wanted a world completely different from the one I knew, where I could channel my energy into something structured, disciplined, where I could maybe learn how to be responsible for something again without being haunted by that single awful mistake. The military was rigorous, but it was also a place where I couldn't simply lie around in bed all day. I had to get up, fulfill duties, push my body to its limits, train, follow orders. In a way, that structure saved me from my own spiral. Every now and then I'd think of that night, especially on the quiet evenings when we were all bunked and lights were out. I'd picture the man's face, his family's screams, and I'd remember the words of his wife. She had sat down next to me in the middle of that catastrophe and told me, with trembling lips, that she forgave me. I used to wonder if that was just shock talking, or if she truly meant it. Over time, though, I came to believe she really did. Maybe she had recognized how devastated I was, how it truly was an accident. Or maybe, after 5 decades with her husband, she understood something about life and love and loss that eluded me at 19 or 20. Maybe in the worst moment of her life she found a compassion I can't even fathom. That thought both gutted me and kept me afloat. I saw a bit of the world with the Navy, got a broader perspective on my life. It didn't erase what happened, but it showed me that life is multifaceted, filled with both unimaginable cruelty and surprising kindness. I started saving money, plotting a course to finish my degree when my service was done. Every so often I still drank too much, but it became less of a daily escape and more of a rare slip-up. I discovered a sense of self that wasn't solely defined by my worst mistake. That was progress. Fragile, slow progress, but progress all the same. Now, I'm out of the Navy, back in civilian life, trying to complete what I started in college so many years ago. I'm not the same person I was before the accident. How could I be? There's a scar on me that can't fully heal, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we're not supposed to forget the tragedies we cause. It keeps us humble, wary, reminds us how fragile human life is. Yet for the first time in over a decade, I can actually go out with friends and enjoy myself without the weight of guilt crushing every moment. I can walk down a street at night without feeling my heart pound in terror at passing headlights. When I look back, there's a huge part of me that wishes it had been me lying on that pavement instead of him. I still feel that way sometimes, especially in the quiet hours. The fact is, it happened the way it did. I was driving, he was crossing, and I took my eyes off the road for a second. That second was everything. I can't change it, can't press undo. All I can do is continue living in a way that honors the compassion his wife showed me. I try to be kind, to pay attention, to carry a mindfulness that I never had before. Even so, I still carry that guilt. I suspect I always will. And yet, there's a sliver of hope in me that I hold on to. If she found it in her heart to forgive, maybe that same capacity exists within me for myself. Eventually. Healing is not linear. Sometimes I have nightmares again. Sometimes a random trigger will bring it all back in a rush. But I have a sense now that life can continue if I let it. I can build a future with this regret, incorporate it as part of who I am without letting it consume me entirely. Years later, I still don't talk about that night with most people. A few friends know, the ones who were at the police station, the ones who witnessed me unravel, but it's not a story I share casually. Some nights I can't talk about it at all without shaking. Other nights I can manage to tell someone new, if I feel they deserve an honest answer about why I dropped out of college, or why I avoid messing with car radios. Each time it hurts, but sometimes the act of speaking it out loud helps me take one more step forward. I remind myself that it was ruled an accident, that I wasn't charged, that there were no signs of reckless behavior, other than that fleeting glance away from the road. Legally, I'm free of blame. Morally, that's a different story. But I've come to see that there's a difference between punishment and accountability. I can't reanimate the past, but I can honor that man by respecting the life I still have. the life his wife insisted I keep living. I'll never forget how she touched my shoulder, tears in her eyes, and let me sob into her arms. In that moment, I felt a grace that transcended anything I had known. That's the memory I cling to, the unwavering warmth in her voice when she said, "We had a good life. I forgive you." I don't know how she found the strength or the faith to say that, but I hope, if nothing else, I can live each day in a way that affirms her choice. That's the best I can do. And so, I continue, each sunrise an opportunity to hold my head above water. Little by little I rebuild a fragile structure of hope, guilt, purpose, and resilience. Maybe I'll never be fully okay, but maybe I don't have to be. Sometimes living with sorrow can be part of living a meaningful life. My path diverged that night, and I will always feel that pain. But if there's a light at the end of this tunnel, it's the possibility of honoring the man I harmed by leading a life shaped by responsibility, empathy, and the kind of forgiveness his wife offered me on that cold, heart-wrenching evening.